Well, greetings again to everyone. Welcome to God's Unchanging Word in this week's edition for News Nuggets and Insights. Today is April 7th, 2017. Lots to cover as always. In fact, we began these to bring out little news and nuggets and pieces of information. But each week as we get into it, there's so much to cover, it seems to get longer and longer. I want to begin with today wishing everyone a happy Passover. Praying that everyone has a very happy Passover season and days of unleavened bread. And we're going to talk about that primarily today. But before we get into that, I want to talk about certain pieces of news for the focus of the week. Today, we're going to talk about God's Spring Holy Days, which is going to be in our main focus. All right, but I want to talk about a couple things first before we get there. Last week, we focused on terrorism. It just so happened again this week that in St. Petersburg, Russia, on April 3rd, another Russian terrorist attack. By the time I put this together, initially they thought there were at least 10 dead. As I began driving to the church today as we were getting ready to film, I heard that could be as many as 14 dead and almost 50 people injured, many of them very seriously. So we need to pray for the world and for our nation to protect itself from terrorism, which continues to rise, and it's not going to be abated before Christ returns. It will only get worse. Same day, April 3rd, Neil Gorsuch, through the Supreme Court nomination, passes the Senate committee. And so what happens next was the article, and the Senate says, even if they have to do what they call the nuclear option with 51 votes, they are determined to get Neil Gorsuch in as the next Supreme Court justice. And we've been praying that that will happen, and God willing, that'll help protect our interest in the freedom of religion, because they are worried about he's too far right. Well, the Church of God, as time goes on, is probably more right than any of the institutions and churches in America today, because we have not moved off of center point, which is the Scripture. The next thing I want to bring out is something that is taking place that we began talking about in the News and Nuggets and Insights on March the 10th. And we're going to be doing this from time to time as we bring out something to your attention. We want to be able to follow up, because this now, with the nuclear tension, is escalating in greater proportions. Just 1 month ago, all right, just almost a month ago, just within a few days, we talked about an article that came out on March 6th talking about the North Koreans who were launching missiles, in which was not only a concern for America, but a concern for China and a concern for Japan and South Korea. The tensions are escalating. So now let's follow through with what's going on right now. Problems in Korea, again, April 3rd. And you know, if we did this every day, if we did a News Nuggets and Insights every day, there would be enough information in the news that pertains to prophetic events and events that will affect your life and mine, that we could do a program every single day. These events I'm bringing up so far and everything, even this, is all yesterday, April 3rd, on Monday. So these things are taking place rapidly as we're moving toward the return of Jesus Christ. President Donald Trump says, and this is an article that came out which brings about, they call it saber rattling. So as Korea begins to flex its muscles, this administration is not going to back down. So Donald Trump brings out, and he says this, that he can solve North Korea's weapons testing program without any help from Beijing if necessary. So he's saying to China, you don't want to help? That's fine. We'll do it ourselves. This is in their backyard. And it's quite interesting because this statement comes within days of the visit of the president of China. So this is really interesting what happens this week. According to the interview that was published in the Financial Times, it goes on to say this: if China is not going to solve North Korea, we will. Wow, that's pretty strong, bold talk about what's going to go on in their own backyard. That is what I'm telling you, which is one of the Donald Trump's phrases that he uses quite often. That's what I'm telling you. In other words, we're going to do it. They don't want to do it. That's okay. We're doing it. That's what I'm telling you. Going on. The assertion comes from 4 days ahead of Trump's meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, a two-day summit at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. So in Florida this week, he'll be meeting with the president of China for the first time. It'll be amid a series of the ballistics tests from North Korea. So the world now is taking notice as to what's going on, and President Trump and the President of China are going to sit down and talk about, and God willing, they can come up with some solutions. In addition to this, one of the things on the agenda is talking about is the trade imbalance of the trade between the two nations. So what we're going to have to deal with in these two things is what's going to take place over the next week over two of the main issues that are affecting America and China's relationship, and one of them is Korea. Now, the article went on to say this. This is from a Seoul. From a defector from Seoul, a senior North Korean defector told the NBC News that the country's desperate dictator, the dictator of North Korea, is prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike the United States and its allies. This came out in an interview with Lester Holt on April 3rd. Again, same day as all of our news. And it's talking about this defector, one of the highest ranking defectors of North Korea. And he said that this dictator is desperate and he will use nuclear weapons. Tae Yong-ho is the most high-profile North Korean defector in 2 decades, meaning he is able to give a rare insight into the secretive, authoritarian regime. Going on, according to Tae, the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is desperate in maintaining his rule by relying on the development of nuclear weapons and the ICBMs. He's using an acronym for the Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, the long-range rocket that, in theory, would be capable of hitting the United States. Once he sees that there is any kind of sign of a tank or an imminent threat from America, then he would use his nuclear weapons with the ICBM, is what he went on to add in this article, in that interview. So what are we saying with all of this? Is that in the middle of everything else that's going on around the world, in this corner is escalating. And as I heard in the news this morning, that many people are talking about this issue with North Korea, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the nuclear testing is probably the most dangerous issue we have facing America today, because you have a very unstable individual and a very radical country that is willing to bring down everyone around them to continue in his dictatorship. This is an issue that we're going to continue to follow in the weeks and in the months ahead. And as things change, we're going to be bringing them to you on God's Unchanging Word through the news nuggets and insights. Okay, Passover and unleavened bread. So now, as we begin to observe the Passover unleavened bread, the rest of the world is observing a day called Easter, which is biblical. Let's talk about that just briefly today in the news nuggets and insights. Passover or Easter, which is biblical? In Acts 12, we read, Acts 12 verse 1 says, "About that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread." In verse 4, and this is where some of the confusion begins to come in about Easter and people keeping Easter. In the original King James Version, which many people use today, you will find the word Easter actually written in the Bible. So therefore, many people will tell you then it must be the Word of God that you keep Easter. But remember verse 3, where it says they were keeping the days of unleavened bread. Throughout the Bible, as we're going to portray a little today and in the next few weeks, is anytime you see the days of unleavened bread, it's always following, not Easter, it's following Passover. All right. Where does the word Easter come in, and how did it get into the Bible? All right. The word Easter comes from a Greek word from Pascha. And the Pascha, the English word for Pascha, is Passover. So if you have a King James Version, all right, so I use a King James Version, or this one here is the New King James Version. Every other translation today that you will get, the NIV, the Authorized Standard Version, all the modern translations, the word Easter that you saw up here just a minute ago is taken out, and the correct word Passover is placed in there. All right, that is a mistranslation that was put in to the King James Version in 16 from the original King James Version in the 1600s. The Greek word Passover is properly translated in the same Bible 28 times as Passover from the same word Pascha. However, the word Easter comes from, and you can do a lot of history, and there's lots, so I'm just going to try to narrow it down a little bit to where it came from. It actually began with Martin Luther, who actually used the word Easter, which was a German word, which later was brought into by Tyndale, picked up by the King James Version as the Authorized Version, and they never changed that one location. The word Easter, it's an amazing German word that comes out meaning Ostern, or dawn, the direction of the sunrise, which is very interesting according to the Scripture, because you see that the time they're observing a sunrise service is found in the Old Testament, which I'm going to read in just a second, back in Ezekiel. It was a pagan custom that people had turned their backs on God. All right, so it was from sunrise. The term comes from using the Easter from a religious worship from the earlier years of paganism, where you find it's used from the goddess, the Babylonian goddess Astarte, or the Assyrian goddess Ishtar. Ishtar. So here we have a word that sounds very similar to the two words, but in reality, these goddesses of fertility in Easter, and then you have the bunny and the eggs, and if you go back and look at the history, you will find all these things point back to a time that was adopted into Christianity that existed long before Jesus Christ came to this earth. Now, we're going to offer a sermon, and when I get toward the end, you're going to see what I'm talking about. It's called The Greatest Deception of Mankind, in talking about Passover versus Easter. What's really interesting that's not brought out by Christianity, God talks about observing the Passover, which is a covenant of entering into the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Easter has nothing to do with that. It's actually representing the time of a resurrection. So what they have introduced into theology, into the belief of Christianity, is a totally different time and a different perspective from Passover. And as we understand, Satan is the great deceiver, or the great counterfeiter. All right, going on. Most critics agree today that the King James Version, in that isolated incidence of the word translated Easter in Acts 12, is in error, and all the other translations have corrected it. What can't be corrected from that now is the theology of the adoption of a pagan custom that existed long before Christ, that is the central point of the highest point of worship for Christians today. And in that point, that day of worship, that morning sunrise service, is the pivotal point of its belief. If you take that out, everything else goes away. And people will not give up this belief. This is something that if you're seeing this for the first time, you need to take the time in prayer before God and on your knees to ask Him to reveal the truth and follow what Scripture says and not the customs of man. Because you will find at the time of Christ and hundreds of years later that Passover is the time that's observed, and Easter had nothing to do with the early Christianity. Satan's greatest deception, and this is the sermon that's online, and I'm going to show you about this in just a few minutes. But let me show you what has been deceived for mankind. It's found in Ezekiel chapter 8. And I'm going to kind of briefly go through this, but write this down. Ezekiel chapter 8. And when this program's over, take the time to go back into your Bible and read this chapter, what God's saying. So now, let's go through this just briefly to see what God talks about the sunrise service, because you see the word from German, the German word means from the direction of the sun. All right, so if you are praying in the morning at the direction of the sun, where are you praying? To the east. To the east. Look what it says. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 1. And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 15th day of the month, that I sat in my house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, and the hand of God fell there upon me. So there's Ezekiel. He's with the house of the elders, and God's hand comes upon Ezekiel. Then I beheld, and lo, the likeness of the appearance of fire, and from the appearance of his loins downward fire, and from the loins upward the appearance of the brightness and the color of amber. And he put forth a hand, and he took me by the lock of my hair, and he lifted me up in the spirit between the earth and heaven, and he brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem. Let me translate that into English. He's sitting there amongst the elders. God reaches out. He sees this great being with these flames of brightness, and the hand reaches out, touches him in his hair, he lifts him up, and brings him up over Jerusalem from the visions of God. In other words, looking down from God's perspective down upon Jerusalem. So now he's flying over, like we would say today if you was in a hospital, you had an out-of-body experience. So what he's doing, God's taking him now and showing Ezekiel what God sees from his perspective. And behold, the glory of God of Israel was there according to the vision that I saw in the plain. And he said, Son of man, lift up your eyes now toward the north. And so I looked up my eyes, and behold, the north gate and the altar of the image of jealousy at the entry, which is another subject all of itself, which talks about the seat that provokes into jealousy, which is a sermon in itself because it's talking about the seat that provokes into jealousy, which is Satan. Because, see, he wanted that job that Jesus Christ has, and he lifted himself up, and he was jealous to be able to sit where Jesus Christ sits, next to the Father. So then going on, and he says in verse 6, he says, Furthermore, son of man, see what they do? Even greater abominations that the house of Israel commits here. Should I go off from my sanctuary, he says? Return again, and you shall see greater abominations than these. And he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. And he said, Dig into the hole, now into the wall. And I had digged into the wall, and behold, a door. Verse 9. And he said to me, Go in, and behold the wicked abominations that they do there. So now he's going, as we see through the chapter, he brings him over Jerusalem. He brings him down to the courts. He sees the seat of the jealousy. Now he's going inside, and he's looking through a peephole. He digs through the peephole. Now he's going inside. And in each step that he goes, God says, each step becomes a greater and a greater abomination. So I went in and I saw it, and behold, every form of creeping things, abominable beast, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed about the wall everywhere. You ever go into a church and I've seen there's all these statues and these images, and many of them have animals in their images. But what Israel had done, they had began to take in the customs of the pagan idolatry of the day and all their worship into these animal forms, and they actually went and brought them into the house of God. In the verse 11, and there stood from them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel, and in the midst of them stood Jezaniah the son of Shaphan, and every man in his hand a thick cloud of incense went up. In the middle of all of this, there were the elders of Israel, every one of them participating in the pagan idolatry in the house of God. And they had the incense. You ever go to a church today and they have people walking through the church and they have all this incense going on? Very reminiscent of what we're seeing in God's warning of great abominations in the house of God. Then he said to me, Son of man, verse 12, have you seen the ancients of the house, what they do in the dark? Every man in his chambers of his imagination, for they say, the Lord sees us not, for the Lord has forsaken the earth. And they said, turn again and you shall see greater abominations than these. When we look at the religious leaders of today, you see more and more being arrested for pedophilia, for fleecing the congregation, for living off the fat of the land. And it's like we're seeing here where God says they don't think God can see them because they're doing it behind closed doors or they're doing it in the dark. And in the imagination of their mind, God says, they think they're getting away with this. And God says, see what they do? How evil it is? And he says, come with me. I'm going to show you even greater abominations than these. So verse 16, so he brings me now to the inner court of the Lord's house. So now we're getting closer and closer to the most important sanctuary of God. So he brings him to the inner court, and behold, the door in the temple of the Lord between the porch and the altar, there were 25 men with their backs. This is interesting now. Now they're in the inner court, but they have their backs to God, and their faces toward the east. What did we read that Martin Luther was able to bring into the Bible? That Tyndale carried it and found its way in through the King James Version. It came from the German word astron, meaning dawn, or direction of the sunrise. So from its earliest versions of being able to interpret the Bible from the Greek through the Latin Vulgate and brought into the English language, it found its way to have in Acts 12, verse 4, the word Easter, which means looking to the east, and the only time to worship to the east is in the morning. All right? So now, go back to what we just read. Verse 16. These 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east. There they are worshiping, facing the east, just like Martin Luther said, Easter, Ishtar, Istarte, all the pagan worship, all found its way into the temple of God, and the warnings for you and I, and they worship the sun toward the east, where God talks about the greatest of all the abominations. Why? Is because they have taken the pagan adoption of worship, of paganism, brought it into the temple, turned their backs on God, and worshiped the sun to the east. What's interesting about this is that God in Exodus 11 says that he had a sign upon his people, which is the Sabbath day. By the time Christianity came after Jesus Christ, several hundred years later, that day of the Sabbath was changed to the day of sun worship. What does Ezekiel say? The greatest of these abominations, they turned their backs on God and they worshiped the sun toward the east. Easter is always found being worshiped on Sunday, where Jesus Christ says he is Lord of the Sabbath. Satan is the pagan god of sun worship. And so what we're looking at of the greatest deceptions of all mankind is being able to think you're worshiping God, but in reality is adopting the customs of the world and worshiping Satan in the time where God says you should be worshiping him. On that particular morning, on that sunrise morning, that very first time, and you see where the world's taking care of Easter, and then another event that took place that totally obscures the plan of God. It's in that sermon that we're going to be offering you, which we'll be talking about. Leviticus 23 says this, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feast of the Lord which you shall proclaim in to be holy convocations, these are my feast. That begins with, is 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath, a solemn rest, a holy convocation. My point, we'll be going through these in the weeks ahead, and we're going to cover the different holy days, but I want to talk about the first one just really briefly right here. The Sabbath day is not a day for the Jews. It's just not. It's a day for all of God's people. It does not belong to the Jews. It wasn't brought in by the Jews. It was a day that was set aside from the beginning of creation for all mankind. For all mankind. So when God talks about the feast of the Lord, he said these are the feasts of the Lord. They're not the feast of the Jews. We need to understand that if we're going to follow God correctly, we need to understand what it was that he was telling us. And here is what he says. 6 days shall be done, shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest. It doesn't say any day, it says the seventh day. And throughout history, what's amazing, you can have a lot of loss of time, but you know what's never been lost? The day of the week. From the beginning of time all the way through, all the changes, through the customs, through captivity, the day of the week has never been changed. It's being changed today, And many people in Europe now are calling the seventh day Sunday, not Saturday. And so you'll be having to confuse the people toward the end time, where God said there'll be changes of times and seasons. We're beginning to see that right now. It goes on to say in verse 4, these are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed time. God's divine appointments. Just briefly, we'll wrap it up and we'll talk about the Passover and unleavened bread with the timing for this year in just a second. God says there's 3 seasons in a year shall all your males appear before the Lord your God in the place that he chooses. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the season we're about to enter into this week. The Feast of Weeks, which begins a 7-week plan of redemption for God for his first fruits. And in the fall, the Feast of Tabernacles. We began keeping this coming week. On Sunday night, we observe our covenant with God at the Passover service. The Lord's Passover. On the 14th day of the month at twilight, at dark at the beginning, is the Lord's Passover, and on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. And that's what we do in the Church of God today. We keep the Lord's Passover on the 14th day at the beginning as we renew our covenant with Jesus Christ. This year, a Passover begins April 10th, which is observed the night before, because God's plan for salvation always begins the nighttime first, then the day. As we see in Genesis, the evening and the morning was the first day. It goes all the way through all 7 days. The evening and the morning was the second day. The days of unleavened bread, the time we put all leavening out our homes and we take in the unleavening of bread of sincerity and truth from April 11th through the 17th. The holy days, there's always holy days on the first and the last day according to God's holy word. Tuesday, April 11th is a holy day where no work is to be done. And Monday, April 17th is a holy day, no work to be done. All right, kind of jumped to this a little quickly here, but so now I'm going to ask for your help, all right? So as we keep the Passover, please keep that in mind. Pray everybody has a great Passover. We'll have lots of stuff on the website that you can get. And many people have written in for a Passover tape. God willing, you've got those in time. If not, maybe we can get Jeff to put it online where you can click to it if you don't have it yet, if you need it, because now it's going to be a little late to mail it to you for Passover. So now, let's switch now to something I've not really done in the past, and hopefully I'm not opening a can of worms here, because I know I can't serve everybody's needs, but my email, we have letters every single week. I get phone calls. There's so much hurt, there's so much sickness and anxiety, and so many prayer requests that's going on. But this one touched me considerably. This comes from a lady, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. This is the background where I'm talking about I need your help. This is where Jesus Christ was talking about those who did what God tells us to do, the good deeds of caring for one another. In Matthew 25:37 says this, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothed you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it unto me. I thought about this scripture when I got this letter. This is from a lady over the years, had been a very dear lady. She's in a nursing home. I don't know her exact age, but I think she's near 90 years old now. And it just was a heart-wrenching letter, and I'm just going to go read some of it. I can't read it all because it's very long. But so here's what I'm going to ask of you, or I'd like for your help, is let me read this, and then I'll tell you what we're asking for. This is from Betty Whetstone, W-H-E-T, not wheat, Whetstone. And when asked if you send a card or a letter, something to let her know that she's loved, because she's in a River Oaks nursing home. So I went through, because in the letter you see it's written really, really large, and her hand shakes so she's not actually able to see it. She says this, one purpose of this letter is to tell you how much I appreciate your labor of love and that you labor on us who are very much in need of it. I had to stop in writing down the poems God had given me because of losing so much vision. I now see vaguely from parts of just one eye and have very little hearing but from one ear. I find that glasses and hearing devices are of no help. Only rarely can I understand the messages in the sermons. And it was just very nice. Sometimes I can hear a sermon from Mr. Counsel and Mr. Danny Ellis. So something in their voices gets through her hearing, and she can hear those too. And it might be in the way it's delivered. So I wanted to pass that on to those so that sometimes even the people who deliver messages, you don't know who you're helping. But here she said that she's being helped. It says, being in a nursing home is no place for any elderly person to be. It's talked about that one that she's in there went up for sale. And so even the best of nursing homes are just, I think they're just pitiful in most cases, but sometimes that's all people can do to give care to the elderly. Then she goes on to say this, I lost the only other member of my family to a horrible death. There was only one who was left from a large farm family, and now I'm alone. My brother was handicapped, severe arthritis, diabetes and asthma, and a very bad heart problem. We depended on each other's phone daily for visits. In other words, she had nobody else. She has no one else basically visits her. Every now and then, a church member can go by. I know one of the ministers we have, Joe Schuster, goes by to visit, but it's an all day. He has to drive many hours to and many hours from to give Miss Whetstone a visit. Her brother died in a horrible house fire that the fire marshals now believed was intentionally set. And it's just tearing this poor lady up. So now, trying to, and I won't read all the story of that. Try to picture this lady near 90 years old in a nursing home from a very large family. Her only joy was writing the poems that she believed God gave her. Now she can barely see out of one eye. She can barely hear out of one ear. Her only comfort on a daily basis was a brother who just got burnt and died in a house fire. That's in the letter. I don't know what to do. The loss and the grief is tearing me apart, and I can't make it stop. What do I do? What do I do, she says. And then she apologizes to me. I'm sorry for such a long letter that maybe you can't even read. And actually, I had to go back several times to try to see what it was she was writing. That maybe you can't even read, but I had to say these things to someone who might care. Thank you for reading what you can, and keep up the good work that you're doing. I'm praying for you. I think we need to send this lady some words of comfort. That we need to let her know, as Jesus Christ says, if you have done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. On the screen I have here, Miss Betty Whetstone, 100 Parkway Drive, Clarksburg, that shouldn't be Drive, that should be Clarksburg, West Virginia, 26301. Here's what I want you to help. I would like for you, if you would, send her a card, send her a letter, and when you write, you need to write really big, because when I correspond with her by letters that I write, I type it in very, very large print so she could read it. Let her know that she's loved, that she's cared, and that we are thinking of her and praying for her. I don't know what it would be like to be almost blind and almost deaf and have no one else in your family to ever talk to again till Jesus Christ returns. So we need to do what we can do to care for this lady through the love, the spirit that God gives us. Will you help me? I hope you will. We have sometimes almost 1,000 people a week watch News Nuggets and Insights. If everybody who sees this week will take the time, share it with somebody else that you know who's in the church. Share it with your brethren when you see them at church tomorrow. And let's just fill this lady's mailbox with love that will just overwhelm her and bring her some peace in this life. I thank you for letting me take the time to be able to share that with you. I know I get many, many letters and emails all the time, and I can't do this for everybody, but this is something we can do. This doesn't cost us anything but a little bit of our time and a stamp. Let's do something to help this lady. Okay, from the vault, moving on. This is what we're offering from the vault from 9 years ago, the greatest fraud that I alluded to just a little bit earlier. It's on the web, and it's actually going to go out in the mail this week. You should have it this coming week. It's called The Greatest Fraud, talking about the greatest deception that's ever been perpetrated on mankind. You need to see this sermon. It's an old sermon, so it's not as crisp as some of the video we have today, but listen to the impact of what's in that information. It's going to absolutely astound you, the deception, what Satan has brought about. Also, we have the Exodus series that if you haven't gone through, what we're going to begin doing next week. We're going to begin talking about each week, and I'm hoping I have time. I'd like to go through and create questions each week so you can go into your DVD study, just like the old Worldwide Bible Study Correspondence course, and take one of the DVDs each week. Take a small portion of it every single day throughout the Feast of Weeks and get more insight into God's plan revealed through the Exodus. Also, for Passover, unleavened bread, here's our main page. If you go to thecogmi.org, on the main page in the bottom corner, you'll see that you can click in that corner, and what's going to come up is a link that's going to take you to the unleavened bread recipes. Take some time this year, bring the family together, bake something you've never baked before. Make this a special days of unleavened bread so that the children can remember for a long time to come. So there's lots and lots of information about your recipes, so you can visit that online. Also in the mail, if you don't have it, you can get one. Just write in and let us know. We will be posting this online, so you can actually read it online. It is the first quarterly for the year. The featured stories center around the holy days, Passover or Easter, which is biblical, and Risen, O Death, where is your sting? In addition to that, we have many articles throughout the edition. We also talk about plans for the Southeast and the churches being able to visit with one another. And the new edition was a sermon that I delivered this past Sabbath in part 2 of the Exodus, the spoils of Egypt. I will actually be delivering on the first day of unleavened bread this year. And it's kind of appropriate. I didn't plan it that way. But that's to talk about the time when they left Egypt, on the 15th day of the first month. So the sermon this coming week on the days of unleavened bread will be the spoils of Egypt. So you can write in and get your copy, and eventually we will have them online, but be sure to get the 2-part series, The Spoils of Egypt, and add that to your previous DVDs on the Exodus, because they all work hand in hand. Before we close today, we have some fantastic music by Doc Patterson. This is something when he was here with his wife a couple years ago. We filmed him and we gave the CD away at the feast. And this particular version of the video is called Little Undine by Opus 101. Doc Patterson was a professor at the University of Wisconsin. He is actually the Dean of Music and absolutely phenomenal on the piano. So if we're ready, let's play that as we begin to close out our program today. That was filmed here in New Orleans in one of our studios just a couple years ago. We actually fell in love with Doc Patterson and his wife when they came to visit. He's an absolute genius with music, a professor, and he's actually, some of his students now have become famous around the world. And we were blessed to have him here to be able to put that piece together. We have a few more in video, but we have an actual CD that we gave away a couple years ago. And we want to thank Doc Patterson and praying for his wife's condition is very serious also this coming year. Well, that's it. That's all we have now for News Nuggets and Insights for this week. Thanks again for watching. So this coming week, have a very blessed Passover and days of unleavened bread, and have a great Holy Day season. Till next week, God be with you.